Alright, so I've not opened this project before, but I can tell you that this 400 megabyte project was way too big. It does not need to be that big because this library folder, if we look at how big it is, it's the majority of what you sent me. And you may not know this, but the library folder is generated automatically when you load the project in Unity. So this library is very specific to your local computer. This is what your computer is processed. The two things that you actually need to keep, or the two folders you need to keep, are the assets, project settings. Of course, you should probably send the VS, and of course, you also want to send the solution file and everything else. Library, you definitely want to delete it because it's just going to um, it's just going to be automatically regenerated whenever I open the project anyway because I have a different computer. So let's go ahead and open this project in Unity 2017. And you'll see as soon as I begin opening it in Unity, it creates the library folder, also creates a temp folder. Obviously, you don't need to send the temp folder, but a lot of people don't know that you don't need to send the library folder either. Whenever we use Git for our, whenever we use it for my online card game, Zems, uh, we we exclude these folders and a bunch of other files from the repository simply because they're going to be generated anyway. So this should load pretty quickly. It's not that big of a file or not that big of a project uh, compared to loading the Zems project, which can honestly it can take like an hour to load because there's so much to process. We use a lot of assets, um, and we've actually considered making a separate repository just for the assets, and then just telling everyone on our team like, hey, you whenever you pull the latest, or if you ever have to clone the project again, uh, you're also going to have to clone this assets project, and then just move a copy of it into the Zems client project. Um, and that's one way of doing it. Simply, it's nice to do it that way because that layer of abstraction means that if you ever have to modify an asset, you're going to write code that's built on top of that asset. If your assets are all in a separate repository, and again, you should only do this if you have a ton of assets like we do, um, it means that you're not going to have the mistake where someone says, hey, I need to change, make a slight change to one of these asset files, and then they make the change, and then whenever someone updates the asset from the asset store, it breaks that change. By having it in a separate repository, people are more likely to say, hey, okay, I want to change one of these asset files. I need to like make a copy of it or something. Let's see. Okay. Yeah, I'm not gonna criticize your folder layout because it's just whatever. So here, what I'm trying to demonstrate is how someone who's completely new to a Unity project might go about figuring out what is what or what controls what. It looks like this is a very simple project, at least in the prototype. I see 3 scenes in here. Okay, this one might be. Let's go back and run this really quick. Okay, I like this actually. I like it a lot. I can't figure out the controls, so I'm gonna look at here. ADSW space. Okay, none of these controls are working, so um, this is obviously not it. But I like that you tested with primitives. That's really good. This is pretty cool. Let's see. Turn off the 2D. What is this built on? Is it built on UGUI? Okay, so everything's running in the UI here. I'm not actually a huge fan of that. I don't actually like the way they did it in Glitch Garden. I think they did it because you learn the UI in like the previous section, And then instead of trying to introduce how to build a 2D project, like just using 2D, they use the UI. So let's take a look through here. Game Manager. This might be the actual stage I'm supposed to play. Game Manager script, player object. Okay, this is starting to look right. You know, you've got a post-processing profile. You've got your FPS counter in here. So you have, okay, that's pretty cool. Proto. You have a giant player script, and then you have player attack, player health. Okay. Alright. Decent organization here. Yeah, okay. Alright, let's give it a quick go. It's actually pretty neat. Not bad. Okay. Again, I'm not going to criticize the... I'm not going to criticize any... Can I jump over this guy? Anyway, I'm not going to criticize the game. I'm just going to start jumping into the code. So let's start with the game manager. It's good to have a point of entry. Kind of like the ent main for non-Unity projects. Most non-Unity projects, anyway. So I use Writer. If you don't know what Writer is, it's pretty much the best IDE for Unity. What we used to use years ago, Writer came out this year. Actually, it officially released this month. What we used to use years ago is Visual Studio with ReSharper. And ReSharper is basically a code analysis tool that runs within Visual Studio that tells you that, hey, you know, your code has something that is not necessary. So for example, this right here where it says as game object, where it's gray, it means that you don't need to do this because when you instantiate, Unity automatically assumes that the type that's going to be returned or passed into player is a game object. So you actually don't need to write this as game object. And then it's giving the reds here simply because there's a better way you could be formatting the naming. Writer is essentially ReSharper built into the IDE. So we used to use ReSharper in Visual Studio because it was a plugin, and because JetBrains, the company that makes ReSharper, obviously doesn't own Visual Studio. They couldn't incorporate it. But now they've made their own IDE. It does unfortunately cost money, so if you're not a startup with some amount of funding, you may not be able to afford Writer. But I highly recommend it. The main reason to get something like this is you want your code to be consistent and independent of developers. You don't want it to be like, oh, I can tell this script was written by this specific person on my team because he writes code in this certain way. You want your code to have a consistent format so people can read it and understand it easily as long as they understand how the project's set up. I'm going to check the usings here because this one, so Unity automatically imports both of these. Now, using Unity Engine, you're always going to need this, but in most cases, you don't need this. So I'm going to go ahead and get rid of it. The reason why is there's a lot of different theories on code, especially on whether you should have code that's commented out. But the general accepted norm is that the smaller your scripts, the better. Because even if you have something like this in here, if you have a bunch of redundant code, because if you not everyone's going to use Writer, right? Like it's not going to be gray for everyone. The more code there is that's not necessary, the more there is to read and kind of get caught up on. So I'm going to go ahead and remove that. Go ahead and remove this. Now here's an interesting one. It's going to say use var. This is because, does it really matter here that it's a type game object? Because most IDEs, unless you're like using monodevelop, but even monodevelop may have this built in by now. You can literally hover over the variable and see that it's a game object, or that it's a type of game object. And var should be restricted, or var should be used more often because in most cases, you don't want to be that specific. If for some reason your object player changes from a game object to, say player was defined up here, Or another idea would be to, yeah, let's just say player was defined up here instead of down here. If you decided to change this layer, actually, let me think of a better way to do this. If you decide to pass in something different, let's ignore whatever I just said previously. There's a better example. So we had game object player. If you decide to change what's over here, realistically, you shouldn't have to change this over here either, right? Like, what's important is that you have a variable player that you can use, and if you have to change this so that player is no longer a game object, you don't want to have to change this as well. It's less code to change, and realistically, if you need to know what the player is, you can most likely look at this player and understand that it's a game object just because of the name. You can also hover over it. In most cases, you want to restrict specific typing. So let's say you have a variable and it's like, I don't know, like, what's something like chance to spawn. So if you have a variable called like chance to spawn equals something, what you want to do here, you wouldn't use var here because in this case, what chance to spawn is, you probably want to know what chance to spawn is. You probably want to know whether it's a float or whether it's an int. In this case, it's important to specify what type it's going to be. But in a lot of cases, you should just use var. If it's very easy to figure out what it is, use var. That way there's less to read and also makes it more flexible to change. That's kind of the gist of it. There's probably some other reasons, and I know I've already spent too much time on this, but yeah, use var more often, unless you absolutely need to know what you're getting or what it's being set to. So here you've got public and private, and this is going to ask you to change player object to be camel case, not Pascal case. Or maybe I had that backward. It's Pascal case, not camel case. So this is because of naming convention. It's going to ask you to put an underscore in front of these. This is because when you look at a variable, you should immediately be able to tell whether it's private or public. The underscore indicates that it's private. What people usually do for protected, and this is, protected is one of those more debatable naming conventions. But generally we would do it like, this is how we do it. So for private, what we use in XEMS is, and what a lot of people use for Unity, there's a lot of discussions on Reddit about how you should name your variables, but a lot of people do underscore for private, uppercase on the first letter for public, and then protected, there's no underscore and it's not uppercase, or the first letter is not uppercase. So the idea is, when you look at the variable, you should immediately know, is this something that is specific to this class, or is it something that another class might be able to use? You know, and if it's public, it's obviously going to be something another class can be able to use, or if it's something that child classes can use. You should be able to immediately tell just by the format of the variable who has access and how it's going to be used. Okay, so just going through this game manager at the start. Okay, so we want to avoid the use of find object of type. And this is kind of specific to how a lot of Unity's magic scripts work. So for example, say you want to get the main camera. A lot of people just use main, okay, camera.main. Okay, so a lot of people just use, it's also gray because I'm not actually using it anywhere else in here in this start function, but this is just an example. A lot of people use this to set the main camera, but if you actually read up on how camera.main works, what it does is it goes through every It goes through everything in your hierarchy that's a camera and tries to find the camera that's assigned to the main camera tag. In most cases, you want to avoid using any sort of find object of type or camera.main. And find object of type does the same thing. It's going to go through everything in here and it's going to say which one has the camera script or which object is the camera script. What you honestly should do is you should either do this in awake. So this is kind of a execution order thing. If you do it in awake, start is what happens when the game is running. Like the player can, in most cases, start is used for when the player can do things in the game. Awake is like, what do we do before the player can actually do anything? That's one way to think about it. Awake triggers before start. I don't want to get too deep into execution order of things, but if you're going to use find object of type over anything that takes a lot of processing power and is generally slow, do it in awake. But in most cases, don't even use find object of type, because it's essentially like, it's almost like a loading screen, really, because the more find object of type kind of searches that you do, like if you have this whole, even if you have a whole awake function full of find object of type, it basically means there's going to be a longer load time for the player before they actually get into the game. So you want to actually assign assign it in the inspector, or pass it in like what's a good way to do it? So you already have a game manager. You might as well just assign it in inspector. Another way is to make a static class and basically initialize it in the static class, or at least get the reference or put the reference in the static class. But there's competing arguments as to whether that's really good. I would just say, and this is also what we do for XEMS, we have in our game manager script, we just assign things in here. It's easier if we want to swap the camera out later. Let's say we want to test out a different camera with a different post-processing behavior, and maybe some additional post-processing scripts, because we don't just use post-processing stack, we use like amplify bloom, amplify color, all sorts of stuff. We may want to pass in a different camera to the game manager without having to go into the code. So honestly, just avoid find object of type. No professional project that I know of uses this. It's slow and it's not really that effective. So I need to verify whether you are using, do you have name of? Okay, you don't. Alright. Well, if you were using the experimental version of .NET, which I think you can activate in project settings, I think it's player or editor. I'm trying to remember. Okay, it's player. Yeah, if you were using the 4.6, you could use name of, but that doesn't really matter. You're calling spawn new player. Yeah. Okay, so you're gonna instantiate the player object at transform.positions. So you're going to instantiate it where this game manager is. Where's the game manager? 34.109.26. Yeah, it looks like the game manager and the player proto is relatively in the same place. So what you're doing is I'm not a huge fan of putting the game manager in a specific location in your scene and then spawning it there. Generally what you want to do is put all your manager objects at 0, 0, 0, no rotation, no scale, and just make a vector 3 of where you're going to spawn your player. Because this is a little, I mean, this creates this weird aspect where the game manager's location actually matters, and it shouldn't matter, because in good project design, your game manager should care about itself. It shouldn't care where the player is going to spawn. It should just care about managing the game. and because of that, it really should not have a specific position that matters. All right, so here's the other thing. This violates the single responsibility principle. Your game manager should be responsible for managing the game itself. Your camera script, this camera script at track object, your camera script should care about assigning itself. So if I go to this script, yeah, again, in most cases, whenever you create a new script, just go ahead and get rid of everything but using Unity engine. That way you have less code until you start getting errors saying you need to import something, then import it. Transform to position, find object of type, track object, get child. So it looks like you have redundant code here. Since this code is also in here, realistically, you should not have it. This game manager script, again, like I said, should only care about starting the game, managing the game. This stuff, like the health bar, your health bar should be the one that has a reference to the player, right? Like it shouldn't be in the game manager. Just like your camera script should care about itself. So really, the problem with stuff like this is that, well, first off, let me check if your health bar also does it itself. Okay, so it doesn't. So your health bar itself does not get the player. It assumes that the game manager is going to pass in the player. Well, this is a problem because if you were to pass this project to another programmer and they were going to work on it, what are they going to think about when they need to modify the health bar? Well, that the health bar takes care of itself. And so when they see this and they're like, okay, public player, and then they check the health bar in the inspector, I don't know if there's a health bar. Where's the health bar sign? Private health bar. Find object of type health bar. Oh, that's useful. So another reason why I don't like find object of type. All right, so I'm going to assume the health bar is somewhere in here. So whenever they find the health bar, the heck? Which one of these is the health bar? This is it. Okay. Right, they're going to assume that the player is assigned here. If they don't see it in the code and they know it's public, they're going to assume it's assigned here. But if they see like the game manager, let's say they go to the game manager. Obviously, my original case of hey, it's not assigned anywhere and it's just magically assigned somewhere doesn't apply here because it is assigned in the inspector. But say that someone looks in the game manager and they're like, huh, why is this here? Is this like tied to the health bar? This is called coupling, when your game manager script and your health bar script rely on each other. And the single responsibility principle is the idea that if someone wants to modify a script, a component, they should be able to go to that component and work directly in it, or possibly a helper component. So if you have like a script called game manager helper, that's pretty obvious, like, okay, there's a helper script, I gotta look at both of them. But game manager and the health bar are two completely separate things, and someone who wants to work on the game manager should not see this stuff. Realistically, they should not think that, okay, well, if I update the game manager, it might break the health bar. And that's not what you want to, that's not the situation you want to be in. So really, again, your script should care about themselves. We've already gone over the variable naming. This would just be slider here. This needs to have a capital P. This needs to have a capital P. Get rid of the unused usings. Now you just have those two. If player, get component player health. Okay, you should cache this. Unity released an update because a lot of people were making this mistake all the time of using get component and update. Update runs every frame regardless of whether, it just runs every frame regardless of anything else. So your get component here should be done in start because it's not like your player is going to change. Like the player health is not rapidly changing between different game objects. So realistically, you should just do I like how writer automatically gives me like what the name should be, or gives me a suggestion for the name. And then here you can just do player dot get component. Let's see. Oh, because it's not player health. It's not a type player health. It's a type of int. Okay, that makes sense. That's how you should do it. It's also less code. It also means that because the value of oh, I see what you did. Okay, so this is actually not correct. So all you need here is the component. Sorry. Here we go. Yeah, so you should cache the component. Might be better to do this. Yeah. Because player health itself is not the component player health. Honestly, it's the problem is not here. This is I just realized this is a really bad name because usually when people see player health, they assume it's a number, but you actually have a component called player health. You should rename this to like um like health just I don't want to say help component, but I can't think of a better one. Realistically, health is such an integral part of it's such an integral part of the player that you probably should have the health on the player itself. Because you have this player script, but where's the health? Why is health a separate component? It really shouldn't be. Because what do you really gain an advantage? Like whenever you're trying to do components and create a modular system, you have to ask yourself whether there's going to be an advantage to isolating it into a separate component. And in this case, I don't see the advantage. When is the player not going to have health? Even if the player is invincible, the you could literally have like a boolean, or you can have some sort of you can have code that basically says the player doesn't take damage. It can be just a boolean like doesn't take damage or can take damage. But having it as a separate component that you can check on and off in case it doesn't take health, that just seems a little weird to me. Um, you want your components to be more like uh, I mean player attack is actually not bad. I like this one, but health is a little weird to me. You want your components to be more like it's hard for me to describe this without actually showing it to you, but basically in our space shooter um, we have a ship. We have three ship scripts just for the ship itself, mainly like a ship model, ship controller, ship view, and then we have ship weapons. Not ship attack, it's ship weapons, and then there's several weapons in there, like weapon prefabs in there. And then there's also like ship shields, uh, and then the shields kind of ties in with the shields implements a eye damageable interface. Uh, and again, I get this may not make a lot of sense to you depending on how new you are. There's a lot of complexity in the way that our projects are set up. But if you're ever in this situation, so I got here starting off by saying you should cache this component. And then it led to this whole like, okay, well, this component is badly named and we probably don't even need it. Um, but yes, so I guess the original point I'm making is cache your components. This way update this way update is not constantly having to do a get component, because get component is essentially going to say, okay, let's go to our player object, and then let's go down every component on this player object until we find the one that matches. And you shouldn't have to do this in update. You should be able to cache the location of the component and just tell the engine, okay, I know the location, or I know the component for health is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. It's the seventh component down. So if the engine knows that, that's really what matters. And then it can immediately just grab the health from there instead of having to every time uh, go to the player object and then just search all the components to find the health component. And I think what this area here is saying, oh no, it's just saying it can be simplified. Um, Sometimes I like it that way, sometimes I don't. This is less code, arguably less readable, or more readable depending on who you're talking to. I don't like this format all the time. It's essentially saying if slider value is equal to, if there's a player, then it's going to be equal to the health component dot health, and if it's not a player, then it's to 0. So this is like the if, or if this is the true condition, this is the false condition. But that's okay. Um, yeah, I could talk about input and how this is also kind of inefficient because it's polling, but Unity hasn't released its new input system officially yet, which has frame rate independent input. It's just a better designed input system. So this is, I'll just leave this okay for now. Track object. I feel like there's a better way to do this as well, but this is actually fine. It's just one way of doing it. Again, we already talked about find object of type. Don't do this. There's better ways to do this. If track object, yeah, that's fine. You have a lot of stuff under the main camera, but it's not necessarily too bad, I guess, to have it follow the main camera. Um, I generally don't like parenting too much the camera because, again, you may want to. Um, so when you parent it to the camera, obviously it's going to move with the camera, and sometimes you want to have more control. Ultimately, it just depends on how crazy you want to get with these background effects. In a lot of my projects, we try to isolate and modularize as much as possible. So I probably would have like a background manager here with the game camera as a component. Uh, that way we can swap out the effects between different cameras, or like move the effect to a different camera if we wanted to. This way the main camera doesn't seem overloaded, and instead we'd have like a background camera that renders this stuff. But again, it's not a big deal. Yeah. One thing about canvases, and again, this is more from like a really big optimization point. In most Unity games, especially a small project like this one, you don't need to optimize the canvas that much. Every canvas, whenever it updates, it has draw calls basically. And if your if your health bar uh, if your health bar updates but your panel here does not, um, one thing you can do. So I'm assuming this panel doesn't update, but your health bar does. When they're both under the same canvas, what it means is that when your health bar updates, this canvas is going to have to be redrawn every single time. And again, this is like like extreme performance optimization thing. Things that don't update should be on their own canvas. That way it doesn't get redrawn every time something else in the canvas changes. So just something to keep in mind. If you're having UI performance issues, just put the stuff that's updating. Everything that updates should like basically have its own canvas, and then everything that doesn't update can all just be in the same canvas. Yeah. Game. Kind of curious what this endgame script is. Okay. Follow player. Okay. I don't like this suggestion here, this reduce if. Inverting it just makes it more unreadable to me, in my opinion. So I usually just undo it. Um, we already talked about camera.main. Don't don't use it if you can, if you can avoid it. Uh, this is one of the areas where dependency injection really kind of helps because there's a lot of references to common things like the camera. Whereas if you're using dependency injection, you can put the camera in like its own config file, and then just do like inject camera main camera. Yeah, you can just do this with dependency injection, and then not even have um, you wouldn't even do main camera. You would just name it probably camera because it doesn't necessarily have to be the main camera. Um, yeah, with dependency injection, if you ever get into Zenject, which is an asset that I highly recommend learning how to use. If you ever get into Zenject, there's a lot of ways to abstract your code and just make it so much more clean. Because you can just do stuff like this. It sort of looks like magic, but yeah, instead of writing this, you could just do this camera.main. You just do camera. And then here you can inject any camera. So if you decide to change the camera later from the main camera to another one, you just change it in the config file and it automatically updates because it's never specified here as the main camera. It's just the script would just assume that a camera is being passed into it. But enough trying to sell you on Zenject. Let's go ahead and get rid of this. I mean, I don't really see too many issues with this. I like the fact that you write private in front of the start and update, because a lot of people would just kind of leave it like, dang it, yeah, just kind of leave it like this. But it's good practice. So this load next scene makes me wonder if I almost feel like it shouldn't be in here because the end game again should just be concerned with the end of the game, like what's gonna happen in the game. It's debatable whether you need to have a function like a public function that loads the next scene. It seems a little weird. Almost seems like you need a state machine, and once the end game state happens, it can simply fire an event that says the end game has happened, and then your state machine would say, okay, the end game event has been received. Now we're going to load the next scene. It seems a little weird to put it in end game itself. And I suppose that's just one thing that I mean, state machines, I don't know how advanced you are. If you're just doing the course, I think their state machine was a switch statement. But I mean like an actual state machine where different states are classes. Like you would have uh, you have a new class that's just simply called where's my class? I'm not gonna make class library, but you would just have a new class called like public class, um, say like end game state, and then it would inherit from like some base state. But basically, a real state machine um, would have classes, or like it would treat its states as like objects. That way, multiple objects in the game can have the same state or different states. Uh, and then your state machine would basically be what your game manager is, your way of managing the game. Of course, not every game needs a state machine, but I like. There are two things I highly recommend for any project. One of them was Zenject because you can get rid of all these like specific dependencies in here. You can just inject them in, which keeps this this class more specific to itself. Like it only cares about the managing the game. It doesn't care about where the camera script is, where the health bar it is. It just gets them injected. And then the second thing is a state machine, because I think managing your game into states, uh, is one of the good things to practice because there are a lot of ways to go wrong and realize that you need more states or you try to pack too many things into one state. But being able to think in that way helps you organize the game better. And state machines are something that you're probably going to do a lot of, honestly. The deeper you go into game development, we use state machines all the time in Zems, and we even use it in our real-time space shooter. And I bring that up because Zems is a turn-based game. Obviously, you're gonna have a state machine, but in our real-time space shooter, we also have a state machine for various different objects in the game as well as the game itself. And it's something that I think it's a good habit to get into using. It doesn't really matter whether you get a state machine asset off the asset store just to get experience with one, but it's something I highly recommend. Enemy spawner. You have a lot of enemy spawners. I feel like you can superclass this somehow instead of having a bunch of spawners. You've got like several spawners that just spawn tank and drone. What I would recommend here is having a super class, like an enemy spawner class, and then putting a bunch of invisible game objects. So instead of having like, however many, like 30 something enemy spawner objects, you would just have one enemy spawner object, and then you put a bunch of invisible game objects in the scene, like literally just create empty, and then just give it a position somewhere in the scene. And then you can name this like, I don't know, you would just name it like spawn point 1 or something. And then your super spawner could simply have like enemy drone, like, yeah, enemy drone, and then have an array of positions where it'll spawn them. That's just a suggestion. There's a lot of ways to organize spawners, but having this many spawners is a little kind of weird. Or at least I don't see it very often. Yeah. Overall, really cool. I like it. I really like the character. Not sure if you made it yourself, but if you did, oh, good job. It's pretty impressive, actually. I've actually not actually used Anima 2D, but it's pretty cool that you figured this out. And I always have a high appreciation for people who take the initiative to do their own things and make something that looks pretty nice like this, because a lot of people, they just complete the course projects, and then they're like, hey Ben, can you teach me how to make some other game? Where are my compilers? Oh. Health bar, health component. Player health. Oh. Yeah, because you had a component called player health, so I need to name it back, or change the name back to player health. Okay. Alright, let's just see what this is really quick. This tutorial Sebastian Lake thing. Huh. I guess the camera doesn't move or it doesn't fall, but then you can kind of go off. Yeah, interesting. And then I think you had an end game script. Or not end game script, but end game scene, end game screen. Just kind of want to see it before I finish up this video. Ooh, I like this. I really like this. Wow. I need to figure out what you did to sprite mesh. Let's see, drone body. Wow, did you make these yourself? This is actually really cool. Platformer Chan. Or is this from Anima 2D? Huh. If you made this yourself, I'm actually very impressed. Anima 2D. I'm actually just going to go ahead and end the video here. There's no point in including this curiosity as part of it, but it doesn't look like it came with Anima 2D. Looks like you might have used this as a base, maybe? I don't know, but I really like your character. Good job on that. So yeah, hopefully my my tips, my sort of analysis of your code, and um, suggestions on how to organize your project, as well as naming conventions and just yeah, mostly just naming conventions. I found you have some pretty good practices already. It's mostly just about get a consistent format of making your code easily readable, and making your variables more descriptive just by themselves. Also, maybe some optimization best practices like not using this. But overall, good job. I'm very impressed with what I saw. I was actually expecting a lot less, and hopefully this has been helpful.